Okay, greetings and welcome. First, let me apologize. You guys have been very long suffering. I really appreciate that you've been so patient with me. It's been an enormous effort to get all these classes online. I was a little behind on your class even before the coronavirus problem hit, and this just pushed me even further. So I appreciate your patience. This is going to be the first part of a two-part lecture. Each part is going to be approximately an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes. I hope to get the first part up today. That's Thursday, March 26th. And I hope that the next part's going to come up on March 27th. And then after that, I hope we're going to do these a little bit more regular, that they're going to come up on Tuesdays and Thursdays around about regular class time. But again, I'm dealing with uploading these to YouTube, getting them processed, getting them created. So if we're a little bit late, I appreciate your patience. Like I mentioned, this is going to be a bumpy ride. I'll certainly be patient and lenient with you. I hope you can be patient and lenient with me. Another thing that happened is that because these are online and I've had a chance to do a few of these lectures now, I realize it's much harder for you to read me when I'm just doing the voiceover. And I don't have a whiteboard that I can go to. I mean, I can doodle on the screen, but that's about all I can do. I did used to have a picture-in-picture for some of these lectures, but I got rid of it because it was too distracting watching myself touch my face every 12 seconds. And I don't think it added anything to it. I think you want to concentrate on the images. But it did mean that I had to learn how to add these images in. And so I went back and revised the lectures that I had been preparing for you because I wanted to make things a little bit more clear. If I throw up an image and it's the full size of a screen, I can easily point to something and dictate it. Now I have to do animations or other things to make those points. It's been a heck of a learning curve, but hopefully it'll go well from here on out. So let's get started. So when we last left off, we were talking about what we called Iberian visual culture, this heritage coming from Spain and Portugal. Spain and Portugal, it's important to remember, are very pluralistic, diverse, multi-ethnic societies with lots of different art forms, not just one or two. They have a long-standing Iberian tradition of sculpture. This is impacted by Romans and by Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, and then later you have the Middle Ages, you have the Visigoths move in, who create all these innovations, and then you have Muslims who come across from the Strait of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula from the 8th century on, and then you have a series of Christian kingdoms, Castile, Leon, who push forward, push further south, and eventually expunge them. But then we also have this strong influx of styles from the north, whether they're Romanesque or Gothic or eventually Renaissance. And Spain and Portugal and the Iberian Peninsula are unique in that their style has always been eclectic. As I've joked many times, they don't really get rid of the old style, they just pile the new style on top of the old style. So when Gothic shows up, it doesn't replace the Romanesque, it incorporates the Romanesque. And then you have these late forms of Gothic that are more ecstatic, more experimental. This is true all over the European world. But Spain and Portugal particularly have these forms of the Gothic, the Isabelline, the Manueline, these very kind of ornate forms of the Gothic. This ultimately matures into the Plateresque. I have uploaded the lecture of Iberian culture. That was the last lecture we had in person, but the PDF of that lecture is now uploaded online if you need to refresh your memory about some of these points. So the big point I was going to make is that Spain has a lot of visual cultural heritage, and it has a tradition of mixing. It takes the Moorish architecture, the stuff from Nasrids, we're talking about Granada and the Alhambra. It takes all of that and incorporates it into this new, uniquely Iberian style. And all of this gets imported into the New World when we start talking about the Viceregal period. So there's a rich cultural heritage. And to be perfectly honest here, most of the visual cultural heritage of colonial Mexico owes its inspiration to the Iberian Peninsula. And that's just kind of a sad truth. We've talked a lot about pre-Columbian art. We've talked a lot about survivals, Aztec and Mixtec survivals into the 16th and 17th century after the conquest. But for the most part, this is going to be a European-style art that is Iberian in derivation, but it has some pre-Columbian ideas mixed into it. And so they add the pre-Columbian to it. Sometimes we overstress the pre-Columbian influences. This is a very natural thing to do. Native Mexicans are the descendants of the Mexica, the Aztecs, and so there's a nationalistic pride in this. But I find, depending on where you get your scholarship, you're going to have some people who stress almost exclusively the pre-Columbian survivals, and other people are going to stress the Iberian stuff. I'm a medievalist by training, and I also did Islamic art. So therefore, I have a little bit better eye for the stuff that's coming over rather than the stuff that's there. But then I moved over to Latin American and pre-Columbian stuff. I gave a paper at the Southwest Mesoamerican Conference where I argued very vociferously that a lot of what we describe as pre-Columbian survival is just Iberian primitivism. It's this latent Iberian primitivism that's coming over from Iberia and not necessarily survival. These are very, very hard issues to sort out. That's one of the biggest problems of talking about art in and around this time period. There was no one saying, okay, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. Just in traditional Iberian fashion, it's mix and match. It's cut and paste. It's very pastiche. Whatever they liked, they appropriated, and they added it to their own. And so we have a very complex, very rich period. So let's talk about what we mean when we say viceregal, Mexico and Peru. A viceroyalty is a designation that means that this is a territory nearly equal to Spain itself. So Spain and Portugal more or less split up Latin America. They have a treaty which basically slices it right down the meridian. That's why Brazil is a Portuguese holding. But we also have to realize that between, I think, 1580 and 1640, Spain and Portugal were more or less allied. And they were being ruled by the same ruling families, the Habsburgs. So we sometimes separate these two great empires out, but they were more or less kind of cousins at this same time period. And for the most part, the Spanish didn't incur on the Portuguese territory. We'll get to the Portuguese later. Today we're just going to talk specifically about viceregal Mexico and Peru. So a viceroyalty is a near equal semi-autonomous authority. The truth is that these were so far away, they were so far away from Spanish control, there was really no way to dictate things from Spain. We're talking, even with the fastest ships, for most of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, it's a 3-month voyage to New Spain. And so therefore, you had to give the locals their own control. And so there would be a vice-regent, a person who was appointed by the king to be the regent. And pretty early on, this breaks down into two major governing areas. There's the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which includes most of the Caribbean, all of Central America down to about the Isthmus of Panama, and all the way up into North America. You may be surprised to know this, but you are standing, if you're still in Utah, I guess if you went home, maybe not, but if you're still in Utah, you are standing in once was the Viceroyalty of New Spain. This was Spanish territory. And it also included things like Louisiana, Florida, most of California, most of the Great Basin. That's an enormous territory. It also included places like the Philippines and Palau and lots of places across the Pacific Ocean. These areas were organized not necessarily by culture or by territory, but by trade. And so there's this enormous Pacific Ocean trade. So we think about this, it's kind of strange to think of the Philippines and Mexico as being part of the same kind of nation, but they were once upon a time. The second major area is, of course, Peru, which is basically everything below Panama. It's going to include Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Chile, etc. And as the area expands over time, the Viceroyalty of Peru is going to get broken up twice again, once into the Viceroyalty of New Granada, and the second time in the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, when they start taking in the regions of Argentina, taking the Argentine, Uruguay, Paraguay, etc. But those are very late. Those are 18th century. For most of this time period, the 16th and 17th century, it's going to be the Viceroyalty of Peru, where the capital is Lima, and the Viceroyalty of New Spain, where the capital is going to be Mexico City. There's a few places that are left out of this. You'll notice there's a big white chunk down here in Belize. There's Belize. Belize is, of course, was a British holding. There's a few British holdings in the Caribbean, and there was a French holding on half of what is the island of Hispaniola. That became Haiti. But for the most part, this is going to be entirely Spanish holdings. Now, the difference in the Spanish holdings is that while you have a upper class that's going to be European or derived, many of these nobles are in fact going to be mestizo. They're going to be mixes between the Indian population and the European population. In fact, that's a good place to stress this. I know I've talked about this to death, but it's very important to get it down, and I wanted you to have all of the facts there. The new laws were instituted in 1542, and were really instituted because of a series of protests by people like Bartolomeo de las Casas, who was a Dominican friar and a reformer, but there were many others. He wasn't the only one, who protested the encomienda system. The encomienda system, of course, basically turned the natives, described in the new laws as Indians, the natives into slaves. If you were an encomenderos, you were a person who had an entitlement to a region of land, and all of the native occupants of that land were essentially your slaves and owed you pretty much as much labor as you could extract from them. And this law changed that. It fundamentally changed that. It turned them from basically subjects into citizens, not subjects to the encomenderos, but subjects to the crown and to the Pope. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, validated this, but so did the Pope. And so this meant that the focus was not going to be slavery, but towards conversion. And this changes everything. It brings an enormous amount of freedom to the otherwise enslaved native populations. It also allows them to claim their heritage. And so we have a kind of revival. I call this period after 1542 the Mexica revival, after the Mexica peoples, because you see a total revitalization of interest in that society. When we look at some of the things that happened, enslaved Native Americans had to be freed. If they were forced to work against their will, that was ended. They basically had to treat the native people correctly and treat them almost like a feudal lord would, but that required that they sustain them in times of famine, that they protect them, that they don't levy any labor or fines or taxes against them other than what the new laws allowed. And so this really revitalizes this region in the 16th century. It's a completely different story than what happens in North America, by the way, because in North America, the native populations are completely subjected. They're deported, they're pushed out, and there really isn't a mixing. But that's not true. In Spain, the vast majority of people living in either the Viceroyalty of Peru or the Viceroyalty of Mexico are in fact natives. They are native inheritors. And then there's a fair number of mestizos or mixed or criollo, which are people who are European born. They're European heritage, but they're born in the New World. And they've lived there their whole lives, even though their parents may be all totally European. So that's a much more dynamic society. That's a much more fascinating society than what you see in North America, where Native Americans are essentially not allowed to mix in and assimilate. Of course, you can look at it both ways. Being forced to assimilate, being forced to convert to Catholicism, probably was a great hardship to these native cultures, but it did mean that they had a greater say-so in their future. And of course, we can't stress enough that a lot of this happens because of Catholicism. Catholicism becomes the new religion, something that we can't leave out here is the Council of Trent. I didn't put it in there, but I should include it. The Council of Trent was this council in response to the rise of Protestantism. So, of course, we have in the early 16th century, we have Martin Luther, the rise of Protestantism. And so the New World becomes a major battleground in what we call the Counter-Reformation. This desire for individuals to preserve the Catholic faith against the heresies of Protestantism. And one of the major features of that is imagery. We tend to think of Protestants, we tend to think of them very benevolently in the United States. America was founded by Protestants. We look at Protestants and we think, oh, they were just looking for religious freedom and the right to interpret religion as they saw fit. But of course, the Protestant-Catholic wars were the bloodiest wars in Europe up until that point, and killed more people than the Black Death. It's really kind of astonishing. 30 Years' War killed more people than the Black Death in Eastern Europe. And Protestants were burning churches, whitewashing works of art, destroying images, etc., etc., etc. So the New World became a great source of strength for the Catholic Church and for the Catholic vision, that they wanted to communicate to the natives of the New World that images were okay. As Protestants were against images, they were against relics, they were against saints. And while the Catholic Church accepted some of the reforms of the Reformer, even the Catholics kind of objected to the excesses of indulgences, etc., that many Protestants complained about. But they doubled down on the things that made them the most Catholic. They doubled down on images. They said, no, images is part of our worship, it's part of our liturgy. And they also said that saints and relics are evidence that the Spirit of God is with us and that we have this blessing from heaven. And this was very important because this was a language that the natives understood. The language of the natives understood images. I've talked about the Virgin of Guadalupe before, but it's very important in this aspect that the new religious imagery takes over the role of the old religious imagery. Remember, we have these long conversations in the class about the teotl and the Ixiptla. The teotl is the presence of the god, but the Ixiptla is the image of the god. And the Ixiptla could be a physical image, like an icon or an idol, but it could also be a person. And the teotl could be the indwelling that exists. And so many of these ideas about the indwelling of the presence of the god in someone pass right into the Catholic tradition, just completely and totally. And so instead of thousands of individual gods and patron deities, have patron saints. And that remember that the Pochteca, that is the Aztec merchant class, had lots of patron deities and lots of religious ceremonies. There's more religious ceremonies in the Florentine Codex than there for the merchant class than almost anything else. It's kind of amazing. The Aztecs kind of institutionalized capitalism in an amazing way. And all of that had religious functionaries and religious importance. And so all of that imagery, the guilds, etc., it gets transferred to saints. And images are the chief way by which they convert new members. And of course, the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe is very important. I won't go over it again. We've talked about it, how Juan Diego sees this woman. This woman appears to him in a blue mantle with stars, with the sun standing on the moon. This is imagery taken purely from this stock Catholic imagery of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, which ultimately comes from the book of Revelation. This is the woman clothed in the sun. But this was also imagery that spoke to their native heritage. The blue mantle being very much like jade and this symbol of life, the sun and the moon. It has all of these features of the duality of the sun and the moon as well. And of course, Juan Diego isn't believed, but eventually he takes his mantle, and it is filled with roses by the Virgin Mary, and he takes it back to the bishop, who then is convinced, and then magically on the mantle, I guess I shouldn't say magically, I should say miraculously. I don't mean to disparage Catholic belief, but miraculously you have this acer poetos, this image made without hands, this thing that indicates the presence of God, and it's specifically given to a native person. And so this was a testament that the Spirit of God, in Catholic eyes, was moving on the native population. And so the Virgin of Guadalupe becomes a very important symbol across this period. She takes on these natures of duality, the natures of Teodul, the natures of Ishiptla, all of these ideas, and she transfers them to the new religion. And so much of the same practice that we associate with Mexica or Aztec tradition continues to move into the Catholic tradition. But it's always very guarded. Catholics were always very nervous that natives were secretly using Catholic ritual as a means of masking their old religion. It's very important to know Catholics aren't syncretists. They're not smashing two religions together. But at the same time, Catholics, unlike Protestants, are not hostile to native tradition because that's kind of their history. The Catholic Church preserved an inordinate amount of Roman legacy and Roman tradition and ritual, but they transferred it over to the new religion and the new faith. And they were very conscientious to do the same thing here, to take existing native practice and existing native arts, but re-employ it in the service of the new faith. But to make sure that the natives knew what was happening, that that this was a transfer of culture and ritual and vocabulary, but the gods were different now. Things were different now. There's lots of writings that say they were conscientious about this. And it's important to know that she goes on to serve as a symbol not just of the new religion, but of Mexica and Mexican identity itself. This is a banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and this was from the War of Mexican Independence in 1821. So when Mexico begins to assert its independence early in the 19th century, the image they choose is going to be the Virgin of Guadalupe. So these images and these ideas are very important to Mexicans and to Peruvians and to people who were growing up and being raised at this time. So now I'd like to talk about what happens in the 16th century. What are the earliest manifestations of this imported Iberian culture in the New World, and how does it meet the needs of the people, and what were its goals? The first church ever built in the New World, the first cathedral ever completed in the New World, is going to be the Basilica Cathedral of Santa Maria la Menor, which is the Virgin Mary of the Incarnation, and it was started in 1514. So 1511, Hispaniola, the island of Hispaniola is colonized, and very shortly after they have permission to build this church. Groundbreaking begins in 1514, but most of the work is actually completed after 1535. This was very, very early in the history of the colonization of the New World, and there were still lots of wars and revolts that happened. It is a politically fractious place. To realize there's lots of different agendas. I didn't mention this earlier, but even when they left the encomienda system, the encomenderos didn't like it and revolted, and there were wars and battles. And of course, this is on the other side of the world from Spain, so Spain can't really enforce its will. It's up to the locals. So you see buildings start in fits and spurts, yet not surprisingly, we have a lot of early churches. And the churches are built as missionary churches. They are built to convert the natives. So let's take a look at this one. When we see it, it is a basilica-style church. You can see that it has aisles on either side and a central nave. When we look to the front portal, this looks very much like a Plateresque style. So if you remember, Plateresque was that early Renaissance, late Gothic style. It had a Renaissance sensibility with semicircular arches and vaults and more classical sensibility. But it was called the Plateresque because it seemed very similar to silverware. That was the style and the manner of a silver worker. It was emphasized heavy decoration and ornament, and otherwise this is a fairly straightforward Renaissance structure. But in true Iberian fashion, the interior of the building is going to tell a different story. The interior is going to be a rib vault. That's a fairly typical kind of Gothic rib vault. that when we look at this, this is going to be expressing this Gothic sensibility. So the earliest cathedral and built in the New World is going to be a Gothic cathedral. I've often joked about this, that there were Gothic revivals in the 19th century in North America, but there was no Gothic revival per se in Mexico. And the reason is because there was nothing to revive, because the Gothic never ended. Gothic made its way to the New World in Latin America, and it never ever fully died out. While churches may have gotten more Baroque, Gothic elements continue to be preserved in Baroque churches going all the way forward, right up into the 19th century. It's really amazing. So this is how we start in this, but the first and most important churches that we are going to talk about, in some of the earliest churches, are going to be the mission churches. These are churches predominantly in Mexico, but also a few in Peru. And the term for these is conventos, or convent. Now, normally in our world, when we say convent, what we mean by convent is a place for nuns. We have this convention where monasteries are for monks and convents are for nuns, but that's a modern convention. A convent is any kind of church that's dedicated to one of these mendicant orders. And a mendicant order is an order that has specifically forsworn three things. One is they have forsworn property, so they take a vow of poverty. They have forsworn sexual relations. They take a vow of celibacy. And then the last is that they take a vow of obedience, that they forswear off being in control of their own destiny. They accept they're going to be part of this cenobitic monastic communal existence. So that's why we call them mendicant orders, because mendicant means that they're beggars, that they require the sustenance of others for their support, that they don't have property, at least in theory. In truth, a lot of these mendicant orders owned a lot of property and had a lot of land and acted like feudal lords in their own right. But let's move on from there. Most of these mendicant orders, there's lots of these, dozens of these, but the principal ones are going to be the Franciscans, the Augustinians, the Dominicans. But there's a number of others. And these are missionary churches. They are called conventos, but they are really designed to convert natives. And they start very early on. There's this great story of what's known as the Franciscan 12, or the 12 Franciscans, who were 12 Franciscans who moved deep into the region of Puebla, Mexico, and from a very early date, as early as 1521, they started building churches and converting people. And every one of them eventually became a saint. And that's really early. 1521 is immediately on the heels of the conquest. So right away, you see a kind of competition that exists. You have conquistadors who are there for power, money, gold, land, those kind of things. But Franciscans are also trying to claim territory because they're trying to make converts. And there's a real power struggle that exists in colonial Mexico. But because the more converts you get, the more power you get, the more members you have. And eventually, the conquistadors lose this battle. That's why the new laws happen in 1542. And it's why they resisted it, because it gave more and more power to the church. Again, you have to see this in context of the Counter-Reformation. The church was looking to strengthen itself in numbers, but also by conversions, by faith, by increasing the faith of people. So these churches spread all through the central regions of Mexico. You find them in Puebla and Hidalgo and all over the region. There's literally dozens of these things. They all have a number of characteristics in common, though. So some of the features of these 16th century mission churches, most of them are going to be Gothic or Plateresque. That makes sense. That's the latest style coming over from Spain. So that's the style they're going to be built in. They're going to have rib vaults, tracery, rose windows, but the facades are going to be mostly Plateresque facades. They're going to have roundels and decorations, etc. There's also a strong number of mujahar elements. These are Islamic elements that came into the Spanish repertoire of decorative designs, including alfiz borders, alfarje roofs. We're also going to see horseshoe arches and a number of other things. So in terms of their decoration, what else are they going to have? There's a couple of other unique features: open-air chapels and courtyards, cloisters, atrial crosses, and murals. Lots of murals, particularly black and white murals, but we'll talk more about that when we get there. One of the earliest and most important is going to be St. Michael the Archangel, San Miguel Arcangel, in Huitzozingo. And this one starts in 1524, but it's pretty much finished by 1529. One of the things that people always comment on these churches is that they have a fortress-like aspect. So when you see this building, this is a 3D kind of model of it, and the best one I could find. There's not a lot of plans of these, unfortunately. But when you see this, it's going to have a single aisle basilica church. This one has crenellations that make it look like a fortress. And then the monastery is almost completely self-enclosed right next to it. It's going to have a cloister. Cloister is usually 2-story. And so this is a kind of self-sustaining community. But it's also going to have a wall that goes around the entire lands. And it's also going to have a large courtyard out in front. And included in that courtyard are going to be posas. Posas are little outdoor chapels. We'll talk more about those in a minute. So as we look at this building, as we look at San Miguel, notice that we have a very plateresque front. I love this OG arch that exists out here on the front of it. It's actually not even an OG arch, it's more of a serrated arch. So this wonderful undulating arch, these tall pilasters, lots of decorative forms, and then the rest of it is going to be relatively bland. So you'll have a central region of a kind of very formal, kind of entrance. The rest is going to be very tower-like, very fortress-like in its aspect. As we move on to the interior, there it is. There's not going to be any side aisles. They're generally going to be single-aisle churches, a single monumental nave. And the naves are going to be broken up into kind of domed sections. Here we go. You can actually see this. You can see how this is typical. The vaults are going to be kind of broken into a series of repeating domed vaults, shallow domed vaults. Now, these vaults are entirely self-supporting, but they use these as an opportunity to decorate with rib vaulting. So the most elaborate rib vaulting is going to be directly over the sanctuary, but there's also going to be rib vaulting in the center section. The rib vaulting is, again, purely Gothic, pointed windows. So typical Iberian stuff. And then down at the end, we're going to have this retrochoir altar screen, retablos, and it's going to be covered in just beautiful decoration. It's hard to find good pictures of these. These are kind of dark churches. They don't have large windows. But we're going to have a series of panel paintings. Most of the panel paintings and sculptures are actually from later, but this actually was created close to the same time period. So immediately adjacent to that is going to be a cloister. A lot of these cloisters are going to be 2-story cloisters. So there's lots of space for the monks. This would have supported a few hundred monks. So they're kind of self-contained cities. But they also would have been schools, and they also would have been workshops. That's another important thing to remember, that they're not just teaching natives how to be good Catholics, they're also teaching them a lot of skills. Remember, these are mendicant orders. They have to beg for their sustenance, but they're also cenobitic. Cenobitic means it's a communal living. So they were capitalistic ventures. They owned a piece of land, they farmed their own land to feed themselves, but they also tried to turn a profit on that land by creating skilled workshops. This was true back in Europe too. This was how they sustained themselves. This is how a lot of monasteries sustain themselves today. I just remember hearing there's a famous monastery that actually makes its own wine. There's several that make their own wine. There's one that makes its own fruitcake. There's a Trappist monastery that's since closed in Utah that was very famous for making their own bread and other things. There's another one that made furniture. These are like almost kind of Amish family compounds in a way. That they are sites of industry. And they invited the natives in to take part in that industry. And one of those industries was the artistic production. They taught them how to make works of art. And so this is going to be the labor pool for most of these conventos, these building of these churches. They're going to be built by manual converted labor. So these are, in a way, going to be kind of the serfs to these, we would call them abbey churches if they were in Europe, to these conventos. And so you have these massive courtyards out in front. Again, you can see the crenellations. Part of this is for defense, but part of this is for gathering. And this is where we get, in each of the four corners of this massive courtyard, we have a thing called a posas. Posas is a little outdoor chapel. And here's where I'm going to deviate a little bit from typical interpretations of these. So these chapels are places, essentially they're baldachins. A baldachin is a canopy, but these are permanent canopies that would have covered altars or sacred sites. And they're made out of stone. They have pyramid tops, but most of them don't. But the ones here at San Miguel do. And then they have a series of decorations. The decorations are borrowed almost exclusively, in this case, from Franciscan imagery. This was a Franciscan monastery, and so that's not to be surprising. The angels here are carrying what's known as the Arma Christi. The Arma Christi is the arms of Christ. So if you look up, you see these shields. These shields is heraldry. If you think about somebody's crest, this is the crest of a particular family. Well, the crest or arms of Christ are the means and implements by which he was tortured during the Passion. So one of the angels holds up a flail, a cat o' nine tails. One of them holds up the crown of thorns. Here you can see it. You'll also notice that this thing has an alfiz. Remember alfiz when we talked about Muslim architecture? It is a kind of square or rectangular border that goes around an arch or a doorway. So this is an alfiz. But the alfiz here is depicted as a rope. You can see that the tassel or the end of the rope is even down here. And the rope has a series of knots. This is a Franciscan reference. Franciscans would they didn't have belts. Belts were banned. So you tied your robe with a simple girdle, and that girdle was a rope. And that rope had 3 knots in it traditionally, and they were knots just like this, and then they were tied and the tassels would hang down. Sorry, I almost knocked over my mic. Hope the audio is okay. And those knots represented the 3 vows of this Franciscan order: celibacy, poverty, and obedience. And so this is clearly indicating that. Now, a lot has been made of these figures and the sculpture. The sculpture seems highly stylized. If you take a look at the sculpture, it looks highly stylized. The drapery is more or less conventional, but doesn't really follow the body. It doesn't give a sense of the body. It's more or less drawn. And people especially comment on this crown of thorns, this wonderful undulating rhythm of this twisting crown of thorns. And this is what's commonly called Tikiki sculpture. Tikiki is a local word, a Nahuatl word that just means laborer. And it's generally meant to mean it is the sculpture, the artwork of native laborers. So these are laborers who are employed by the Franciscans to create this. And in this, people see pre-Columbian survivals, especially when you look at like the tassels down here. The way they handle tassels, you can see the tassels over here. They're flat out. They look flame-like. These look like flame tassels on pre-Columbian art, and especially this woven, crown that exists. I think we need to take that with a very large grain of salt. I'll explain more later. And they also say the same thing of the atrial cross. The atrial cross is a cross that is out in the atrium or the courtyard. And this one is damaged. It's got some broken bits on it. Some tail ends over here are kind of broken. But this dates also from the middle of the 16th century. You can see that it has this scroll. The end of the scroll is broken, and the end of this arch, it would have had a piece over here. And this thing is elaborately decorated. Again, here is the crown of thorns. You can see how this intersects and interweaves. If you remember some of that beautifully compacted design, interweaving serpents that we saw in Aztec art, that looks very, very similar there. We see that form there. Notice that we have 3 marks indicating the 3 nails and things that look like blood issuing forth. This is clearly a tree. So people look at this, they say, well, this is obviously a pre-Columbian style being fused here. That's a very, very hard thing to say for certain. I have to say it does resonate, certainly, with things that we see in Aztec sculpture. But we have to remember that Iberian architecture and Iberian sculpture, particularly Iberian sculpture coming out of Spain in the late 15th, early 16th century, is what we call Isabelline or Manueline. It's Manueline if it's in Portugal, it's Isabelline if it's in Spain. These are just the 2 different monarchs that were ruling at the time this very inflected, affected style of Gothic happened. And if we remember, that stuff was noted for these flame-like forms, for these intricate, serrated and braided forms and crockets. I mean, look at these braided column capitals. This took me forever to find this image, by the way. I was looking for an image online. I shot one with my iPhone out of the book, but you can hardly see it. Look at these braided capitals. Look at these flame-like capitals. These are acanthus leaves. Same with these flame-like forms. Now, this is Mexico. Oh, notice the alfiz again? So there we are again. There's that Islamic trend coming out. Look at this all over surface decoration. Just to remind you, this is... Here's an example from a cloister, a Manueline cloister back in Portugal. This one's from Porto, Portugal. All of those same characteristics are there. And so we have to be very, very careful when we start saying, oh, well, this is Aztec or Mexica. Is it? I'm not so sure it is. This kind of wonderful, ornate, interlaced, flame-like decoration was a feature of the late Gothic in the Iberian Peninsula. And we don't necessarily need to go to pre-Columbian survivals to explain it. The same thing is true for all of these atrial crosses. When we look at this atrial cross, the cross is likewise decorated with the Arma Christi. So the Arma Christi are, again, the things that were used to torture Christ. So we have the tongs that were used to pull the nails. We have the flail. We have the column that he was tied to when he was whipped for the flagellation. We have the crown of thorns. We have the nails. So these are the Arma Christi. Here's the chalice that caught his blood. All these other things. But again, here's these flame-like forms. Here's this twisted braided forms. And there's a tendency of people who emphasize Latin American studies to say, oh, well, this is clearly pre-Columbian. This is Aztec survival. We can find these things in the Iberian Peninsula, and so we don't necessarily need to go there. So we have to make very, very careful that if we say, hey, this is pre-Columbian, we can compare it to something pre-Columbian and we don't have a survival existing somewhere else. The same thing is true for these exterior courtyards. It's commonly said, pick up any book on Latin American art, and they will say, well, Aztecs, Native American peoples, their worship was on the exterior of temples. The temple was reserved for the god or the high priests, and most of their worship was on the exterior. So when we see these exterior chapels, such as this at the convent of San Luis Obispo, this one's in Clamanalco, this is just the corner of one of these massive courtyards, and it was never covered. It was always open to the sky. As you can see here, it's a grainy photo, but it gives you a sense of what it was like. So when we see these posas, when we see these outdoor chapels in these courtyards, what they say is, well, this was a way of dealing with the kind of worship that natives were used to. They were used to worshiping outside. So they moved the services outside, and so these things just become like the pyramids. They become pyramids and they become backdrops to the services because the natives were used to meeting outside. I think this gets a little condescending, and I think it's actually inaccurate. The truth is, if you look at most medieval churches in the history of the medieval world, most of the religious services are outside, even in Europe. The church was reserved for very high masses and very important services. Marriages didn't happen outside. I mean, marriages didn't happen inside. They happened outside the church. We're used to having things inside. We just assume that, okay, all the important stuff happens inside. But that's not the case. Even in, France, most of, right up until, the 15th, 16th century, most of these services are happening outside. And there's plenty of exterior chapels in Spain and in the Iberian Peninsula as well. So we can't say for certain if this is, in fact, a native practice, or if, in fact, this is just a traditional Iberian practice. I mean, in warm countries, church services happened outside. There's plenty of exterior chapels in Italy, Spain, and Greece from the medieval period. And so this might just be a continuation of that tradition. There's no air conditioning in the 16th century or in the medieval world. And so if you are inside a church and it doesn't have a lot of ventilation, it gets very hot, it might actually be better to do it outside. And then you also have to bring up the next argument, which is, well, if they're trying to emulate native practice, why didn't they build pyramids? Why don't they build wakas or platforms? Those are the things that really identify native belief, not being outside. Outside's kind of logical. It's actually pyramids and platforms. So I think we overread these monuments. I think that these monuments are almost fully explainable within the Iberian tradition. Yes, they're richly decorated. Yes, they have a love of decoration and all over surface decoration, which was true of Mexica and native peoples in the New World. But that was also true of the Iberian peoples as well. So I think what's happening here is a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced than a lot of scholars want to admit. I think what's happening here is that rather than these being pre-Columbian survivals, these are Iberian styles that resonate with the natives. I think this is much easier to see when we get to the manuscripts. When we get to these beautiful manuscripts, the Mendoza Codex, the Florentine Codex, all these other beautiful codices that are produced at the end of the 16th century, you'll see that they are much more, it's much clearer to see that these are predominantly European books, at least in style, and it's a lot easier to sort out what's European and what's pre-Columbian than it is to do that with architecture. Anyhow, so let's take a look at some of these others. This is another one of these very early ones, San Agustin. This one here, again, beautiful plateresque facade. This facade is really high style. Let me just compare it. So if we just go back to San Miguel and we look at San Miguel's facade really quickly, you notice how simple San Miguel's facade is. It's just more or less decorative. It has a few roundels. The same is true as for some of these other facades when we take a look at them. When we take a look at, say, hang on. Yeah, say for example, we take a look at Tezcatlipocan, when we take a look at Tezcatlipocan, it has a relatively simple facade. These indicate, whenever we see a very simple facade like this, there is a tendency to suggest, okay, well, these are native artisans and native workmen that have been trained by Europeans. But when we see a really nice high-style facade like this with lots of intricate decoration, oh, well, these are going to be Spanish artists and Spanish craftsmen. I want you to realize just how incredibly biased that is. It may be true, but it may not be true. This could be done by native artists. This could be done by native artists, and they were just very well trained by Spanish artists. Again, these Franciscans, these Dominicans, these Augustinians, many of them are artists and trained masons, and they would have trained the natives as well. But generally, because of this high style, this one's regarded as being done by Spanish workers and Spanish artisans and not by natives. And so there's a horrible trap that we fall into. When anything looks really classical or really Renaissance or European, oh, that's an imported artist or an imported style. And how do we know that? How do we know that this isn't a native artist that said, wow, I really like this new style, and who became really accomplished in the new style? And whenever we see something that's flat or graphic, oh, we say, well, that's a native artist. Well, how do we know that's not just some Spanish monk that came over who got shoved into doing this, and maybe he wasn't the best trained or the best skilled? So there are all kinds of strange biases that you encounter, and the truth is, we really don't know. We don't know who the artists of many of these 16th century monasteries are, so we always have to be careful. But this one is really loved because it has this very beautiful classic high style. So we have a series of entablatures. This is a plateresque early Renaissance style. It mixes all of this beautiful character together. So we have a series of columns. In the columns, we have very classical figures. We have figures in the spandrels, and lots of classical elements. So this is showing evidence of influence from Italy coming over, but then blending and being added upon in Spanish styles. So we have these very important crests. This is one that we'll talk about here in a minute. I don't know why I highlighted this one. I should have highlighted this one. Here's a detail. Here it is. This is this one over here. I just put the highlight on the wrong one. And this is a case where we could say that is clearly going to be native style. And you can tell. So the shield and the shell is from European heraldry. But take a look at the arm. It's a severed arm. It has a scalloped edge. If you remember the statue of Coyolxauhqui or the statue of Coatlicue, those show those typical scalloped edges. It has the bone emerging from it. It has the blood coming out, and the blood is terminating into pendants that are probably meant to represent jade pendants and shells. This is all iconography. This is all iconography that's associated with the Aztec world. And this is a toponym. This is a place name. This is the site of Alcamán, which according to legend has this Aztec myth associated of a person being dismembered and the blood giving life to the region. It's this very typical kind of Aztec imagery. So this is a case where we can say definitively this is Aztec imagery. There's no other place this comes from. It doesn't look anything like the European stuff. Even then, it's a little bit problematic because take a look at that forearm. Take a look at the carefully delineated muscles in that arm. That elbow, oh my gosh, that elbow is a work of art. This is somebody who really knew naturalistic form. That's not something we would associate with native artists. Aztecs had beautiful design, but they didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of these anatomical details. They just didn't care. It wasn't what they were focused on. So here you can see the problem that I was discussing before. You know, if we take a good look at this, is this evidence of a native artist? Or is this evidence of an imported artist. So here we have a facade that everybody says, oh, well, this is clearly imported artists. These are high-style Spanish artists who've come over from the old country, and yet they're expertly creating native styles. And then you have to say, well, wait a minute. If this was a native iconography with this scalloped edge and this, severed arm with the head of the bone, I said femur, but that's a leg. I'm sorry. It should be the humerus. Apology. I'm an art historian. I'm not a doctor. Damn it, Jim. Anyhow, but the anatomy suggests that, okay, well, maybe this was a trained artist. So it shows just how fungible this is. Take your pick. You can pull the evidence any way you want. I suspect that a lot of this beautiful high-style stuff we see is actually done by native artists, and that they were just well-trained, and they liked it. And I suspect that a lot of this low-style stuff that we see, that we say, oh, that's a native artist, was actually just an unskilled European. Anyhow. So beautiful facade, wonderful details. When you look up, there's a better image that can give you a sense of it. You can see the high classicism of it. Some of it has been broken, obviously. But particularly when you look at figures like, in this case, St. Paul holding the sword and the drapery. Notice the little seraphim that is underneath the pedestal that he's standing on. We also have, looking up into the arch, ceremony offerings of food. We have this representation of figures in the spandrels. And we also have just little putti, classical little cherubs and garlands, this high classical style. So, but at the same location, where we have this beautiful classical facade, we have this thing, which is a atrial cross. So this is again the atrial cross at this location, at Akelman. And again, we get into the complexity of this site. Generally, when people see these crosses, they want to make these analogous to pre-Columbian objects. So they compare these, for example, to the Tree of Life, this very strong Mesoamerican theme. So here you can see these trees of lives. This comes from Mixtec Codex, and the cross-like form that these have. And so what they're saying is they're trying to impose the old beliefs in the world tree onto the new emblems, which is the cross. Okay? And there's a strong desire to see in this Aztec imagery. This is another example of what we might call Tequitqui sculpture. And here we have the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary is, again, here's a flail, here's a skull. It's a common emblem to have a skull at the base of the cross, because according to Christian tradition, where Christ was crucified at Calvary was known as Golgotha, or the place of the skull, and according to an early Christian tradition, that was where Adam was buried. So the blood of the sacrifice of Christ bleeds over the skull of Adam, the first man. And so the implication is that this overcomes the fall of Adam. And so you can see things associated again. You have a flail here, you have the rooster that crowed thrice, a chalice, the pliers, the ladder. This would have been the ladder that people used to go up onto the cross and torment him. You have the spear. There also would have been there's a sponge on the other side. There's a nail. These are all features of him being tortured. And when we look at this stylistically, it's a lot simpler than the facade. When we look at the facade, this is obviously a different artist or a different set of artists. And when we look at the facade and those beautiful statues, they look very Iberian, more believable, late Gothic kind of style drapery. And then we have a completely different style here at the same site. And so really we have to have this incredible discussion that we've had already. How do we define what is a native survival? How do we define what's native art? As I mentioned, that's very clearly in that toponym from San Agustin and Akelman. That's very clearly Aztec imagery. There's no other place that imagery comes from. And yet at the same time, that arm is very, very classical. And so you have two sets of evidence, one arguing for Spanish construction, another arguing for native construction. Over here, for example, this is another one. This is an angel. This is from Tepoztlan. Um, and in this case, you have an angel, and it's very flat. It's very graphic. It's almost like a low relief. The edges of the figure are squared off. And because these are things we associate with Aztec architecture, we say, that's Tequitqui. That's got to be an Aztec artist. But think about this. There's nothing in that imagery that is associated with Aztec imagery. It's an angel. It's a very conventional angel. It could be medieval. And there's plenty of flat, not very good high-style sculpture in the Iberian Peninsula. And so you could make the same case there, that this isn't. See how complicated this issue is? It's very, very difficult. A little bit easier to sort out is the murals. One of the major features of most of these churches is going to be mural decorations. And we see these decorations in cloisters, in the upper and lower stories. And the murals, not always, but often are black and white. And here, there's no debate about the origin or the style of these things. So remember, the 16th century, we're just a couple centuries on from the invention of mass block printing. And one of the things that really was able to move from one part of the world to the other was prints. And if you were an artist and you were trying to create a work of art in the New World, there's no other artwork to look at. It's not like you can travel to the next city over because they don't have anything either. So where did you get your art? Where did you get your influence from? You got it from prints. And that explains why these are black and white. It seems a little bit literalist to like, okay, we have black and white prints, we'll make black and white murals. But that's clearly the influence. When we see these, the depth, the level of them, they're very clearly 16th century Renaissance prints. So we have these scenes of the Virgin Mary. This is obviously the Last Judgment. So here you see Christ in this bandorla. He is stripped to the waist, looking very much like these Renaissance themes. Here we see details of the torments of hell. These are very typical from Last Judgment scenes from the late 15th and early 16th century. Look at the beautiful interlacing. Look at the beautiful vine scroll work on the letter work. It's really amazing. Here's the flagellation, another example of this. And so this is all purely out of the kind of Renaissance tradition. It's a series of scenes of crucifixions and mostly focusing on the life of Mary and the life of Christ. The argument here is that the reason these things are out in the cloister is that this is for the teaching of natives, that the natives are not that familiar with what the traditions are, and so you want to remind them of the stories of the founder of the religion and the very important features of the religion by showing them these. So these become outdoor kind of sites for catechism, for the instruction of catechumenates. Catechumenates are people who are learning the Catholic catechism, the doctrine, and that's who they're for. Again, just because we're in the New World, that doesn't necessarily that makes sense. I have to stop and argue that these are also cloisters. These are cloisters for monks. And if you go around and look at imagery, one of the most common things is that in monasteries in the Old World is the concept of the Vita Christi. That is, that a monk is supposed to emulate the life of Christ, the Vita Christi. That's what it means, the life of Christ. And so showing scenes of the life of Christ and life of Mary are not atypical. Now, this kind of style, this black and white mural is, again, I agree that that's almost certainly coming from printed material. But we don't know how these were used or viewed in context. But there's lots of these style murals. And it seemed like probably because they had printed materials, it was easier to copy these. And the features are very clearly evidence of the Renaissance. Notice that we have the styles of a printed Renaissance piece. Notice the floor is in perspective. So the introduction of one-point perspective is something that's completely unknown in the New World. This is something that's a feature of the Italian Renaissance, quickly gets exported to Spain, and then gets exported to the New World. The emphasis on all of the knotted up anatomy, this is very typical. The heavy outlines, This is all very typical of 16th and 15th and 16th century religious prints. We see similar things at the convent of San Nicolas. This is a convent of San Nicolas Tolentino. This is an Octopan in Hidalgo. When we look at the facade, again, typical Plateresque facade. We have that arch with the coffered decoration in it, and we have lots of different surface decoration. Again, this silverworker style that's moving towards decoration. But when we get to the interior, we're back to the Gothic again. So we have this mix of Gothic. This altar screen back here is a kind of neo-Baroque altar screen. So this was all added later, so you can ignore that. But everything above you is original, including this painted ceiling. We'll talk about that in a minute. And just like every one of these other convents, it has its own cloister, which is 2-story, which is very common, pointed arches as well. And it too has an outdoor chapel. So these outdoor chapels or outdoor courtyards out in front of the church, again, were for big gatherings. But again, these are monastery churches. These are convents. And so the interior of the church is going to be for masses for high purposes, for special masses. And this is what is called the Indian chapel. This is called the chapel because it's dedicated to the teaching of the Indians. But again, that's not so different from the European tradition. So we have a decorated ceiling that indicates something like a coffered vault, but it's painted. So we have a coffered vault in here. And then we have large panel paintings, and the panel paintings are again going to be scenes of Christian instruction. So we have scenes over here of the Last Judgment, and if you take a look at some of the details, we see all the wonderful tortures that happens to people who don't actually listen. So you can see people are being grilled on racks. You see these demons with their terrible wings. You see these people are hung upside down on spiked poles, and then demons come along with pliers and nippers to nip you. Nasty stuff. So scenes of torture. A lot of argument has been made that, again, this is something that would have resonated with natives because natives had human sacrifice. But again, I'm not sure that works because there's nothing here especially that is peculiarly native. In fact, it's kind of anti-native. Pain and suffering and bloodletting are scenes of torture. These are bad things. But scenes of pain and suffering and bloodletting in the New World were good things. This is about the restoration of the world. It's a little easier to make this argument when you're talking about the Armor Christi because maybe an Aztec or a Mexica or Nahuatl speaker would have resonated with that because he sees the sacrifice of Christ and the bloodletting of Christ as equivalent to the bloodletting of his own culture. But I'm not so sure that works here. We also have other scenes that are, again, scenes of instructions. They look just like Renaissance scenes. So here we have scenes of the story of the Bible. This is the story of the expulsion of the Garden of Eden. So we have the fall up here, and then here we have the expulsion of the Garden of Eden, destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and again, scenes of the people in the afterlife, also scenes of salvations. This is Noah and his ark. But we get away from the so-called Indian chapel, the outdoor chapel, and we go to the stairwell, and we're back to black and white murals again. This one has a little bit of color. You get color in the hands and etc. And this shows scenes from the life of Augustine and also Augustinian bishops. So this is relevant. This is an Augustinian monastery, and so therefore that makes sense. And so we see scenes of scholars, and these are, again, we have one-point perspective. These are coming right out of the Renaissance tradition. So, it makes sense. You have prints. You transfer these prints into large-scale murals. You're essentially copying these, or if not copying, you're copying the style. It's absolutely shocking how much of this there is. Richard Perry is a... is it Richard Perry or David Perry? I think I'm confused. I think it's David Perry. David Perry is a guy who's a scholar who lives in the Yucatan, and he has a blog, and he just goes to all of these churches, and it seems like every 4 or 5 years somebody is peeling off the paint on one of these churches, and under one of these churches is another one of these wonderful monochromatic representations. This is again another one from Claumanalco. This is Brother Martin de Valencia, who's one of these early Franciscan missionaries who moved into the area. He was one of the Franciscan 12 that I mentioned earlier. This one is from San Paolo, and this one again was very badly damaged and was painted over and was only just recently discovered in the last 20 years. So there are dozens of these little churches that have these black and white murals. So they're all over Mexico. So this must have been something that was a huge trend. This one again shows Moses. This is Moses receiving the Ten Commandments and the tablets of the law. So again, that makes sense. If you are monks going out into the missionary world, you have a people that are largely illiterate. What are you going to bring to them? They understand images. So you're going to bring books. You're going to bring illustrated Bibles and prints and books of these things. And then when you start building your churches, after you've trained these artists, after you've trained these people, this is the kind of art that they would have seen. So if you're seeing black and white prints and black and white printed books, that's what you're going to create. It's a real kind of phenomenon throughout Mexico. Again, because these things look so European, there's a strong tendency of scholars to suggest, oh, well, these are being made by recent arrivals. These are being made by Spanish monks that came from Spain or were born in Spain. And they're pretty early, but they're not that early. They're the middle of the 16th century. Some of these might be as late as 1560s, 1570s. Some of these we can probably date to earlier than that, but most of these are coming from the middle of the 16th century. By that point, there would have been a full generation or two of native peoples growing up in the Catholic Church and growing up in the shadow of these monasteries and growing up in the tutelage of these monasteries, gaining instruction, learning how to make art, etc. So these, I tend to be suspicious of every claim that suggests these couldn't be done by native artists. I think that's just bigotry. I think a lot more of this is done by native artists than we could ever admit. I think most of it's done by native artists. And it varies, and I think that the differences in style, we always want to attribute a difference in style to the influence of Aztec art. I think it's probably more attributable to a lack of skill. It's really hard to admit this. I think it's easier when you look at the manuscripts, and we will be looking at the manuscripts in the second part of this lecture, that there really is a profound loss of artistic heritage. The pre-Columbian heritage is lost in part because it's suppressed, but then it's also lost because the native artists are trained by the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and they're trained in this new style. And I think the natives really liked this new style. I think they liked it. They approved of it. It was associated with the new religion. They saw hope in the new religion, and so they wanted to move with that. So whenever we look at these things, they're nearly, these are nearly 100% European in derivation. But even when we look at things that are clearly trying to reference pre-Columbian themes, which we'll see in a bit, it's going to be more or less 85-90% European, with just a pastiche of the pre-Columbian thrown on top for local flavor. Here's another one of these. This one in Tezpotlan. And in Tezpotlan, again, another one of these very almost fortress-like churches with a very relatively simple facade. This is one we saw earlier. This is the one where we saw those angels from. But look at what's on the actual gable. So you see this very much plateresque style, but on the gable we have an image of the Virgin Mary. And it is not just an image of the Virgin Mary, it is the image of the woman clothed in the sun, standing on the moon. It's the Virgin of Guadalupe. So this imagery is going to be popping up again and again and again. And of course, there's that angel again. We get to the interior. This is almost getting boring at this point. Every single one of these ones has this kind of domed interior, but it's going to be decorated in Gothic rib vaulting. Again, ignore most of the lower stuff. That's all put in the 17th and 18th century. And then we're going to have murals again. In this case, notice the geometric patterns of the murals. This is an emulation of Islamic geometric ornament. This is, using plaster and paint to kind of create the sense of what we know as an alfarge roof, of a roof made of wooden segments that are put together into geometric order. And then when we get to San Miguel at Ixmiquilpan, we have again another plateresque style. We have multiple pillars, decorative style, fortress-like church. This one's not a very good image, but it gives you a sense of what that facade looks like. Semicircular arches, and now you can say it along with me, Gothic rib vaults interior into these kind of domed arches. This one we have a little bit, again, it's hard to catch. But when you look up into the roof, you see what is a fairly typical kind of Renaissance wooden roof, but this time emulated in paint. So what's amazing to me is these are not wealthy monasteries. These are very, very early buildings, all from the second to third quarter of the 16th century, maybe a little bit into the fourth quarter. So we're talking between 1525 and 1575 is when most of these are getting put down. This is the very earliest periods, and they're actually way out into the hinterlands. These Franciscans and Mendicant orders went way out into the hinterlands to convert people. They went past the zone of the initial conquest. They did that deliberately. They wanted to convert people first and before they got conquered. And they're doing the best they can, but they're really working overtime. This one again has a cloister. The cloister has Gothic vaulting. Notice the black and white murals on the side. But this one is really truly special. Ixmiquilpan has murals in the nave, so notice the Gothic vaulting, that's original. But these murals in this case really try to emulate the pre-Columbian cultures. And these date probably from the 1570s, maybe the 1580s, and they're really beautiful. So right off the bat, you should recognize we have a jaguar and an eagle. And the jaguar and the eagle are done in a European-esque style, but the jaguar and the eagle themselves are Aztec symbols. This one's standing on a cactus in a lake, and you can recognize that iconography. This is the story of the foundation of Tenochtitlan, of Lake Texcoco. Below this, we have a scene of warriors. And in the scene of warriors, we have a variety of these different warriors. This one's a little better, easier to see. The warriors are clearly meant to be pre-Columbian warriors. They carry macuitos or macanas. These are the obsidian-lined clubs. They have round shields. They carry bows and large, kind of back fans and arrows and atlatls. We have scenes of conquest, of people being thrown down. In other scenes, we actually see them wearing god suits. Here's an individual. I coughed into my elbow, just so you know. So here we see an individual. He is wearing a leopard god suit, and he is sitting here. Notice that we have speech scrolls. Isn't that amazing? So these speech scrolls that go all the way back to Teotihuacan, we start seeing these speech scrolls indicating the breadth or the speech of the individual. Here he's carrying a severed head. So this is very clearly, even though we have this kind of strange dragon-like monster here, taking this person's body and trampling through, this is very clearly meant to be a representation of these pre-European warriors and their battles. Its context here is kind of mystifying. It seems to be giving a sense of the early history of Mexico, and the fact that this is validated in a way. This is a part of the nave that's not near the sanctuary, so this is true in other medieval churches in Europe. Things that aren't near the sanctuary, we can fudge, we can show secular themes. And so I think this is showing the tumult that happens before the arrival of Christianity, in the same way that you would show stories from the Iliad. Stories from the Iliad and the Odyssey pop up in Christian churches all the time. Stories from the Volsung sagas show up in Norse churches. So there is this kind of incorporation. So Aztec culture actually becomes, Aztec and native culture becomes to Mexico what Greek and Roman gods or Norse myth was to those cultures. And I love the sense of this. It's just really beautiful. He's even wearing a hat that's reminiscent of the Tateone, the ruler and the leader. So we see all of this very, very clearly pre-Columbian, except in one way, and that's style. And that's really, really remarkable. When we look at these speech scrolls, they don't quite look like speech scrolls in the Mesoamerican. A speech scroll in the Mesoamerican thing is a little bit more squared off, and then it has these bundles on it or flowers that come off of it. These actually look more like acantha scrolls. When we see the human figure and you see the drapery of the human figure, the sense of the anatomy of the figure, these look more like... I just sneezed into my elbow too. Again, this looks more like modern Renaissance, kind of acanthus. So same thing with this scroll work. If you remember the wall, if you remember the decoration on the the wall of the ball court in Chichen Itza, this beautiful scroll work. But the scroll work here, the conventions are going to be the conventions of European conventions. Same thing here. What is this dragon supposed to represent? I think it's clearly supposed to represent one of these pre-Columbian Mesoamerican deities, a kind of feathered serpent. But if you look at it, it looks kind of Chinese. It looks, and that makes sense because remember, New Spain is part of the same world as the Philippines, and so there are Chinese porcelains coming over, and this very much influences European arts and decorations. So what are we looking at here? It's such a hard thing to describe. It's clearly meant to evoke a pre-Columbian scene, but it is a pre-Columbian scene done in a largely pastiche European 16th century, a little bit of Chinese vocabulary, visual vocabulary. And it's very, very puzzling. So, is this a European artist attempting to depict a pre-Columbian past? Or is this a native artist trying to honor his past, but is heavily influenced by all of this European styles, or even kind of Chinese styles that are coming in? It's hard to say. It's a very, very difficult thing to say in what we're looking at conceptually here. It's important to realize that they're probably still figuring it out themselves. And then likewise, when we look at this example, the convent of San Juan Bautista, same format, fortress-like, huge courtyard in front, single-aisled nave, large courtyard. Notice we still have these little outdoor chapels, the posas. Here, this one's another wonderful example because we have a beautiful Plateresque style facade. This one's a little bit more minimalist, these long, elegant lines. But this is one of the best expressions of the pure Gothic that we've seen. We have this pure Gothic rose window, a series of spiral windows. But we get to the interior, and again, we have this domed vault, murals, but we also have this Gothic rib vaulting that's included. So far we've been talking mostly about Mexico, and these have been in places in Hidalgo and Puebla, in places that even today are kind of off the beaten path. Remember that if you build a church in Mexico City, that's the capital, so it's going to get rebuilt. And it's going to be torn down and rebuilt. So that makes sense that these early mission churches are going to be off the beaten path, because just by accident of survival, that's where something's going to survive. But also, that's where you have to go to convert people. So a lot of these 16th century churches are really kind of off the beaten path. Same is kind of true of Peru. We haven't talked about Peru, but let's get to Peru for a little bit. I know we're going a little bit long, but let me stick with me if you can. So when we get to Peru, we have this at Chuchuito. And again, notice we have a kind of Plateresque facade. It's been repainted at some point, so that bright yellow, I think, is not quite right. So we have this typical Plateresque facade. When we get to the interior, this church has really suffered. We have this, again, retablo, and this one dates to the time period. This is a little bit later. This is going to be 1590 to about 10. We don't know the exact date of this, but these really tall, elaborate retablos are going to be the future. We're going to come talk about painting in a while. One of the major centers of painting, this is not far from Cusco, Peru, and one of the major centers of painting is going to be in Cusco, and so we call it the Cusco style. Here is another example. This is San Pedro. This is also in Peru. This one has had a kind of porch built onto it, later addition, but again, looking at a predominantly Plateresque style. But the place this really shines is the interior. Again, a lot of this is neo-Baroque, a lot of this is added later, but we have this incredibly beautiful roof, and the roof is broken down into a couple of different segments. We're looking at the segment that goes back. Notice the colors. The colors seem to be evocative of Peruvian textiles and textile patterns. But when we get closer to the sanctuary itself, the sanctuary has an actual alfarje roof, one of the oldest that's been preserved in the region. And here you can see we have this double square, this 8-sided star, this very Islamic style ornament. This is all covered in many layers of paint and stucco, but it is this kind of style that exists. Okay, so that gets us through most of these mission-style churches. That seems like a good place to break. I'm going to stop there. In the next section, we're going to get into the manuscripts, what's happening in manuscripts in the 16th century, and also what's happening in painting, and set up a little bit about what's going forward. As we get into the 17th and the 18th century, the 17th and 18th century is really a golden age. 16th century, things are still a little rough, they're a little primitive, we still haven't kind of found our bearing, but as we move into the period that it's the Baroque period, we move into what we eventually call the ultra-Baroque, that by the time we get to the 18th century, they take all the Baroque innovations. Remember, the Baroque hasn't happened yet in Europe, and all of the innovations that happen in Europe get imported to Mexico and to Peru almost instantaneously. So we'll save that discussion for next time. Hoping to get that lecture up soon, the second half of this lecture up soon. If not, just hold tight. We'll have it by Tuesday. I'm still working on this. Thank you for your patience. Again, these are uploaded to YouTube. You can watch them on YouTube, any device you want, as long as you have the link. They're unlisted, but there are no comments on YouTube. I've disabled the comments, so I would prefer you to comment here on the discussion. And comment on everything. Am I rambling? Can you understand me? Is the volume high enough? Are the images good enough? Can you tell what I'm talking about? It's so hard teaching to a screen or a camera and not having a class to interact with. So save me, please. Comment in the discussion. If you have any questions, that's going to be the discussion board on Canvas. And I hope to see you soon. Please wash your hands 20 seconds. Stay away from your loved ones that are elderly or might have compromised immune systems. We will get through this. I will see you to the end of the semester. And of course, as always, thanks so much for listening in. Bye.